Welcome to Greek for a Week. I'm glad that you are continuing to follow us along through the book of First Peter. As you'll notice here, we are going to be looking at three verses this week, chapter 2, verses 15 through 17, and that will wrap up our particular paragraph here, verses 13 through 17, under the heading that I've titled Be Submissive. Which basically stems from the command that Peter gives in verse 13 to submit. So let me go ahead and walk through verses 15 through 17. Let me translate, and then we'll talk through a couple of things that I think might be helpful. Because, so he starts here with a conjunction, because this is the will of God. By doing right, to silence the ignorance of foolish men, as free people and not as having a covering for the freedom of evildoers, but as slaves of God. Honor all people. Honor all people. Love the family of believers. Fear God. Honor the king. So if you think through a couple of things related to each verse, let me start with verse 15. I want to start with specifically the first word, which is a hati. And I'm starting there because that is a conjunction that really relates back to verse 13, the command to submit. Here in verse 15, I believe the hati there is a causal clause that's giving us the reason why we need to submit. Basically, Peter saying because this is the will of God. And the participle here, doing good, this participle, you notice I translated by doing good or by doing right. It's a present active participle, masculine accusative plural. And again, I use the word by because I think it's a participle of means. Basically, you can submit, if you will, by doing what's right or doing by doing good. And then ultimately what's happening then, you have the word to silence. So here is our infinitive form. So by doing good to silence. Okay. Now, it's a present active infinitive. It's also an exegetical infinitive. All right. So what it's really doing here is I translated this as the word this. So because this is the will of God, and what is the this? And that is by silencing. So this is the will of God. You're going to silence those who are ignorant, those who are foolish men. And the reason why you're going to silence them is because you are doing good. Why am I doing all of this in the first place? Because of the word submit in verse 13. Then as we move forward in verse 16, we have the word hosts used 3 times. And the word hosts there is used 3 times, and they go again all the way back to verse 13. In a sense, he's saying, submit how, or what is your role? Well, he says here as free people. Then he also says, not only as free people, but not as, you could say, providing this covering for evil, but, and then here's our contrast here. Here's the contrast, but as what? Slaves of God. So there is a meh Allah construction here. These two, this construction, that provides, again, the strong contrast. Not as this, but rather as this. So I think in verse 16, he's providing the specificity, if you will, of the role of the people that he's initially given the command for in verse 13. Jump down to verse 17, he gives some further commands. Now he says here, this command, temesate, second person plural, aorist active imperative of temao. All right. Then you have agapete. Well, that's an imperative, but that is a second person present active imperative of agapao, basically love. Then he has here the word fear, phobeste, second person plural, present middle imperative. The emphasis, I think, with the middle imperative is on the people that Peter is writing to. It's you yourselves, you fear God. And then he comes back to tamate here, and here is your second person plural present active imperative of tamao. I think what's interesting, if you see how these are laid out, you have an inner pair, if you will. You have love and fear. So you would have love here, and then you would have fear here. Then you have honor up top, and then you have honor down below. Well, what's interesting, this is kind of a chiastic structure where the inner pair, those commands are regarding the relationship with believers and God, making them, if you will, the more prominent pair, whereas the outside pair both have the word honor, and those are regarding the societal relationships in which this particular people group find themselves, again, living in their community. So, living in their community, they are to be submissive. That's straightforward with verse 13. As we move down into 15, 16, and 17, he describes basically why they are to be submissive, because it is the will of God. Describes their role being submissive as free people, okay? As slaves, not as the kind of people that offer freedom to the evil, if that makes sense. And then verse 17, the following commands to specifically deal with the relationships that they have within the community. Trust this has been helpful. Rather a lengthy video, apologize for that, but I wanted to make sure I covered all of that. I didn't feel like separating any of those verses would be helpful, so I just grouped them together. Have a great week. Next week, we're going to diagram verses 13 through 17. See you later.